Thank you so much for joining us bright and early on this Thursday for our Take It Down, responding to non-consensual creation of intimate imagery in schools and districts. You've likely seen that acronym NCII used, so really breaking that down today. We're very excited to have two featured speakers today. We have Erin Moat, CEO and founder of Innovate EDU, and later on in the presentation, we'll be joined by Paul Katcher, product manager of Securely. So our agenda for today, just going through some quick welcome and agenda setting here. We'll then do a content briefing that will really break down today's topic and introduce a few resources. And then we'll be joined by Paul for a Q&A with him and Erin Moat, and we'll have time for audience Q&A as well. So as we are going, feel free to use the Q&A section to add your questions to the chat. At the end, time permitting, we will be going through those. Another quick note, we are recording today's webinar. We will send out the recording, slides, as well as the resources we introduce after the session is over. Likely we will send on Monday due to tomorrow's holiday. And before we kick it off, I do want to give a big shout out to the EdSafe State and District Policy Labs. We fully recognize the importance of this topic and addressing it, but they gave us the push that was really needed to host this public webinar. So again, thank you so much to those 10 states and 17 districts for your partnership. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Erin Moat from Innovate EDU.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. I know it's really early. I see lots of folks, some joining us from Rome, Sao Paulo, Seattle. So thank you so much for joining us for this critical topic. I'm Erin Moat. I'm the CEO and founder of Innovate EDU. And today I'm going to hopefully give you a bit of a primer around non-consensual intimate images and the intersection with both existing school and district policy, but also a bit of an action plan as we look at the rise of NCII in our schools. So first, it's really important to name that the emergence of non-consensual intimate images, CSAM, child sexual adult material, and DFII, deepfake intimate images, is rising in our teens' lives, in our school communities, and it's happening at an alarming rate. And so we, as schools, districts, education agencies, want to be supporting young people and educators in meeting this moment, both with resources, but also a deep understanding of this topic and what they can do. I'm grateful for Paul joining us a little bit later in the conversation to talk about things that we can do right now using existing district filtering software as a means and methods to really have a defense around this work. But a defense isn't going to be enough. We're also going to need an offense. And so today I'm here to provide some of those resources for you. So right now, it's really important to understand what is happening in this massive growth. So deep fakes generated by AI and AI bots, AI images, AI tools are rising at an incredibly alarming rate in our school systems and in society. And close to 96 to 98% of those images aren't cat memes or fake videos around animals or Sam Altman shopping at Target. They are around non-consensual intimate imagery. That rise of deep fake images, deep fake intimate images, and non-consensual intimate imagery is really creating a social crisis in our schools and with our young people. Next slide. So I want to take a second and just define a couple terms here, and I'm going to do that as we go through this webinar. So first, we have NCII. You might have heard this term. This is non-consensual intimate imagery. This is around the distribution of private sexually explicit images or videos without the depicted person's consent. Then there are Deepfake intimate images. These are AI generated depictions where a person's likeness is placed into explicit content. There's no original real image that exists, yet the harm remains absolute. NCII has existed for a really long time. DFII is what is really fueling this crisis. Among that, I would just name that there's an ease of use issue here, where we've seen this explosion of nudify apps that have really lowered the barrier to entry, allowing really anyone with a single social media photo, any sort of photo, to generate explicit content in seconds. And I see some of my colleagues from Brazil on this call. This is something Brazil and the Brazilian government has done a lot of work around to actually attempt to stop nudify apps from springing up in their country. And I'm deeply grateful for their leadership in this work. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about NCII. So first, we've talked about intimate imagery. This can also include self-generated content as well as secret recording. So again, this intimate imagery, NCII, has existed for a long time. It's the deep fake element that is really this artificial generation that has really sprung up to accelerate the growth of child sexual adult material and NCII in our society. It's really important to name that there is a issue here around consent, right? Taking a single non-explicit photo and nudifying it or placing it in artificial generation software so that it creates these images is really important to name that threat of distribution, that creation without explicit, ongoing, and conscious consent, even when maybe the original image was shared consensually, is the violation of the law here in the United States, as is the creation. Next slide. So, what's happening? I'm grateful to our friends at the Center for Democracy and Technology. They are incredible allies in this work and have really led this charge around what is happening. Now, this data is from 2024, so I just want to name that we've seen pretty astronomical growth in this data. But the last good national sample we have from young people is that 39% of them have heard of NCII occurring at their school. 15% of them have encountered deepfake NCII about themselves or a friend, and 65% of young people feel that their school is unprepared to handle non consensual intimate images at school. Next slide. Some of the more recent data that we're getting is that 1 in 8 youth are being targeted through NCII. Now, this is not necessarily a nationally representative sample of data here in the US, so I want to caution that. CDT is our last nationally representative sample, but you can see that growth. And this fallout isn't really confined to digital platforms. Maybe you're familiar with the Take It Down Act, which is about digital platforms removing the images and victims having a set of rights there. We're going to talk about some of those resources later. But one of the things that we're seeing in this growth of the 1 to 8 is that peer-to-peer digital sharing is really increasing. And schools are finding themselves really on the front lines of mitigating the reputational and emotional fallout of non-consensual sharing. So these, even if this is happening outside of school and not on school networks, what is the consequences are coming into schools. The trauma is coming into schools. And we've seen some really well-reported incidents of this happening in school districts across the country. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the psychological and the gravity of harm that we're seeing from these incidents. And I want to really acknowledge a whole set of victims' rights advocates that have joined EdSafe AI and a host of other organizations like ENCODE and Center for Democracy and Technology and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to help us really understand that this is a very challenging set of harms that are generated, not just from the image itself, but the fallout of that and the long-term incident response that schools and districts are going to be needing to prepare educators, counselors, and administrators to really handle when this happens. So, this is happening in your schools, this is happening within social networks. That is the reality. And now it's time for us to really think about how do we do the training, the professional development, and the technical infrastructure to mitigate that harm. So first, we're seeing from young people who have been affected by NCII that there is severe anxiety, depression, and often PTSD symptoms that are equivalent to physical sexual assault in the victims. And so this many people say, well, this is a victimless crime. It's just an image. It's not actually a sexual assault, and it's fake. But the psychological trauma here is severe and significant. And so the educational disruption. So, one of the other things that we're really seeing is because of this trauma, victims are often avoiding school. They are experiencing academic results. Their grades are dropping as a result of this. And sometimes they even feel forced to transfer schools or districts because of the fallout and the psychological trauma from this harm. And young people report irreparable reputational damage and withdraw from their peer support systems as an outcome of this. And one of the other things that's really interesting about some of the victim interviews that NCEM and others have been doing is that uh, this social isolation isn't just related to peers. It can be related to parents and adults in their lives who, because they're unfamiliar with deepfake intimate images and the use of AI, that in the beginning parts of this trauma, young people are having to defend themselves and to say these aren't real. And it really is breaking this critical trust between students and adults. Next slide. Now, not only is there deep harm to young people and to victims here, there's also incredible legal and compliance risks for states, schools, and districts in this work. So, first of all, there are already extensive CSAM, child sexual adult material laws on the books. Minor explicit material possession is a felony, regardless of whether it is generated or not. So, there are some gradations of material possession between misdemeanor and felony, but in the U.S., in most states, it is a felony, and in the federal system, it is a felony. The intersection of this with Title IX and mandated reporter is very important for schools. So schools must look at deepfake intimate imagery and non-consensual intimate imagery as a sexual harassment claim, creating what's considered a hostile environment. So this is covered by existing regulatory regimes under Title IX and mandated reporter in states. This is an existing obligation. These are not new obligations. And so it's very important for districts and states to recognize that this is a new front in the Title IX and mandated reporters spaces. And then finally, it's important to note that we see both in state laws and in federal laws increasing uh, legislation related to creating a federal civil cause of action. So, victims being able to sue institutions, perpetrators, and companies. And in the last legislative session in the US, there were over 91 laws introduced around this issue, both the civic cause of action and deepfake and non consensual intimate images. So many states have new laws in this area around enforcement that could affect public institutions. Next slide. So I want folks to really think about three dimensions of responsibility that are particularly important for schools and districts to think about. First, we have some of our international folks on the call, so I appreciate this, and many of you have duty of care and safety international laws that are specific to your country, which would be covering this content. So schools have a legal mandate to provide a safe learning environment. Both in the UK and the US, failing to respond to cyberbullying and harassment can lead to massive liability, and we have seen that happen. I'm not trying to scare people. What I'm trying to say is we have a new front in thinking about DFII, NCII, not just from a child sexual explicit material lens, but also from the cyberbullying lens because of how it's created. And again, that transom of home to school interaction, legal intersections. We just talked about this, but there are explicit photos of minors fall under existing child protection laws and CCM regulations. Newer state level revenge porn and federal take it down provisions also intersect here. So this is very important to hear that there are sort of a complex legal intersection of a set of laws. And then don't forget what I said about Title IX and our existed mandated reporter laws, that those also apply here. And then finally, one of the things that we're seeing that can be a really effective, positive place for youth and for schools to play is that schools really are becoming a primary vector where bystander innovation training can be accomplished. So, peer to peer reporting, peer to peer support, and really helping to change cultures, helping normalize sharing leaks, right? When this is happening, and also helping change cultures around mocking victims, that this is not a victimless crime, that there's severe psychological trauma that is a result. Next slide. So, I want to now talk about what you need to do. So, first of all, I'm going to share some emerging data around who are victims of this crime, particularly around young people in a second. But the first thing is, do you have an immediate response protocol in place? The first thing that you need to do if you are a school or district who is encountering this is to secure the evidence via your IT teams. Do not share or store this on personal devices. You need to train your teachers and your educators and your administrators that storing or sharing this intimate imagery, even if you are trying to be in a response protocol, could put you in a place where you are having this material on a personal device. And so this is very, very important that there is a distinction in the distribution standard around personal devices and institutional response devices. You need to report this immediately to law enforcement. So this is something where you need to trigger this reporting structure from a mandated reporter perspective immediately. And reporting centers like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, they have a whole suite of resources that we're going to be sharing that are particularly built for schools, school counselors, and victims around this issue. And really thinking about how you prioritize the victim's psychological needs over disciplinary urgency. So, how do you start from a restorative justice victim response protocol rather than just a disciplinary urgency protocol? We're not saying you don't have to do both, but really thinking about the psychological harm and trauma that may be occurring for that young person. Next slide. So, here's some roles and responsibilities that we think are really important for folks to be thinking about. So, first, state leaders have a role here. If you are a state leader, and I know we have some on these calls, really helping issue statewide safety guidance particular to this area. Funding AI literacy and the prevention for students and staff is very important here. This is where that bystander education is incredibly important. So, if you are a state agency, if you are a state Department of Education, really thinking about how you are being a support here, issuing guidance, thinking about AI literacy, training and supporting staff. And I know some of our states have done an incredible job around professional development here. Not all districts are resourced the same way. And therefore, we really need to be thinking about those support mechanisms. Again, all of this content is going to be available on the AIPolicyLab.org website and through EdSafe AI. So this is a great first step, even just sharing this webinar so folks have an awareness. Next, district leaders really need to be looking at this from their acceptable use policy. Is this covered in your acceptable use policy? Now, one thing that we have seen is that there are policies which govern the creation of this material and being really explicit. That includes using Nudify apps or fake or AI generative apps in order to create this. And thinking about how you update your code of conduct almost immediately. These are places where existing policies can be used to really augment response protocols here. And then, do you have, as a district, an incident response plan in place? Have you thought about that? Today, we're going to be sharing one incident response plan that you can look at as starter dough from our colleagues in a policy lab in Linwood out in California that they developed. We're incredibly grateful that they've made this open science and open source. And you can take that resource today and begin to work on that. And really, these next steps with professional development. This is a scary issue. But educating your educators, your school counselors, your paraprofessionals, even peer leaders that you might have among your student population can be incredibly important in making sure that we're really having not just the crisis intervention, but the long-term trauma mitigation that we need to be doing relative to the creation and the distribution of these images. We're going to talk about this. One of the most effective things that you need to do right now, and it's sort of a go back and look at it immediately after this call, is what does your filtering software look like? Are you filtering for NCII and DFII and these Nudify apps? One of the things I really want folks to understand is that we've entered a place where NCII and DFII is seen as foreseeable harm. And so you can't just decide you're not going to monitor for these images to reduce your liability. That actually potentially could expose you to more legal liability. You have a defensible position when you are taking proactive steps to mitigate the bad effect here. And so that can be content filtering, that can be professional development, that can be having that incident response plan. You really need to be moving to a place where you are mitigating foreseeable harm. And we're at a place where, from a liability perspective, someone shared with me that they call this ostriching. Ostriching does not work here. It does not insulate you from liability. Please be very clear about that. So there's some urgent action that you need to take. Thinking about what's your rapid response IT protocol, including making sure that you're not sharing these images on personal devices. That can actually get you into some really interesting space around distribution, and you want to make sure to limit the legal liability here. So having that rapid response IT protocol in place, making sure you're securing the images for law enforcement and any disciplinary action or victims' rights actions that need to take place, really, really important. And so those are immediate action steps that if you don't have those in place, you really need to be thinking about doing that over the summer months. Our building admins and counselors really need to take the lead here on, and our educators, on leading trauma-informed education here and really thinking about it from a victim's rights responsibility. And because one of the things that we're seeing in the creation of these images, particularly because we're seeing such a high creation rate, particularly all the way down to 13, even younger, many young people don't actually know if they're experimenting with this technology. That they might be committing a crime. And so, really thinking about those restorative justice models and making sure that you're managing for sort of the types of things that could be seen as extreme disciplinary action. And so, how do you find that middle ground? I think there's some really great resources, again, from the Center for Democracy and Technology around that work. And then finally, our counselors here need to be trained, our nurses and health professionals, really to be informed here around crisis intervention and really thinking about how you're doing that long-term mental health monitoring for victims and for perpetrators. So really important to be thinking about this, that this is also often a peer-to-peer crime. And so how are you thinking about it for both sides of this issue? Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the best practices we're seeing in structuring incident response protocols. So really thinking about that immediate response, that short-term response, 1 to 2 weeks, and that long-term or ongoing response. And as I've shared with you, there's both the supporting the victim piece of this and managing the perpetrator. And because often perpetrators are under the age of 18, we have a special duty of care here as well. So, first, immediately when this happens in the victim space, to really begin to ensure the safety of the victim. Does the victim feel physically safe? Does the victim feel mentally safe? Starting the image removal process immediately. Enforcement is now in place for the federal take it down standard. And so digital platforms have the obligation in the US to remove these images within 48 hours of reporting. And so starting that process immediately to begin to remove those images and to have that formal notification go in place, and then assigning that victim a dedicated school advocate. And I would just urge folks to really think about who's the trusted adult in that person's life who can help guide them through this psychological, emotional, and potentially academic harm. Now, in those 24 hours with the perpetrator, really isolating that person from the victim, preserving evidence on digital platforms, and notifying parents immediately. This is really important, this preservation of evidence. Now, we don't want to get in a place, this is a crime. And so we want to be really clear that you have a mandated reporter obligation here, and you must also preserve the evidence. So this notification of law enforcement is very, very important, and it is an obligation under under mandated reporter in many states. Short term, you need to set up modified uh, sort of social supports for the victim and the perpetrator in terms of isolating the victim. One of the best practices we've seen, and you need to be really clear here that this is not retaliation against the victim, is modifying class schedules to really prevent that social exposure and arranging counseling, working with parents, informing parents, supporting parents. Again, we're going to share some resources here around this. And then you really need to be thinking, again, in line with your code of conduct and your acceptable use policy, which I hope you've already updated, that you're thinking about what's the discipline from the school. Suspension, expulsion, restorative justice methods, really important here, and thinking about what mandates you might have for that restorative justice and behavioral therapy. And then finally, long term. So things you need to be thinking about. The obligation doesn't end after 2 weeks. We are seeing long term trauma here for both perpetrators and for victims. Again, just really want to name that. And to establish these periodic check ins, building custom academic recovery plans if possible. Again, naming, we're seeing increased chronic absenteeism from victims. We're seeing long-term academic grades and impacts here. And so what's the supports that are going to be in place? And then finally, with that perpetrator, helping them understand about what happened here, doing digital literacy re-education, and really monitoring for sort of harassment that might be happening in this cycle. Next slide. So, uh, how do you do this work? So again, really thinking about how you are changing that code of conduct, explicitly naming AI generated intimate imagery as sexual harassment, blocking notify generator sites on all district devices and school devices. Do you have a way for young people to come forward? How are you strengthening reporting lines for digital image abuse? And then really with staff, clarifying that AI images trigger mandated reporting. I also know that many states have not updated their mandated reporter training that they might have as an annual training obligation for educators and teachers to cover this area. If you're a state agency and you provide that service, really thinking about what those updates need to look like. Our friends at CDT have put together a model policy. Again, we always say model policies are starter dough and to look at your state and local regulations here. But CDT offers this model policy, which we think is a really strong starting point if you do not already have this. And just remembering that you have likely existing policies in place as part of your district tech policy stack, your acceptable use policy, your code of conduct, which can be shifted and changed to address this threat, as well as any new policies that need to be in place. place. And then again, I just want to really shout out Linwood for putting forward their model incident response plan. Again, we see this as starter dough. It might not be the right incident response plan for your school or district, but it is a place to get started. And again, really echoing those best practices. Hopefully, those resources are incredibly useful to folks in this webinar. Next slide. So I want to name the Title IX components here, particularly for folks who might be thinking about that. There are disproportionate impacts of this technology on female students. They're about 85% of targets in schools. And our LGBTQIA students also are at very high risk. And you can just see that they make up the vast section of victims of these acts. And so paying special attention to what is happening here in terms of our most vulnerable populations. Next slide. So, if I was giving you a roadmap of what to do, I would say immediately really thinking about your AUPs, your existing policies, briefing staff on AI related tasks. How are you deploying digital citizenship and AI ethics units? What are your regional reporting ties with law enforcement? This is a place where it's really important that you have those structures and systems set up, that you're not just thinking about your local ties, but also what are your regional reporting ties to federal agencies if this goes further, and then just continually monitoring generative AI trends. One of the things I will say about this, and Paul and I are going to talk about this in just a couple of minutes, is these Notify apps are popping up as fast as governments and agencies can take them down. And so, really thinking about how you're monitoring these trends, and potentially, if a large platform deploys something that might be close to the line. So, earlier this year, Grok deployed a Bikini application that really got very close to the NCII DFII line. And I would just name that staying on top of when services might push out features that could create an environment where you might see a surge of this activity, to be on top of immediately blocking those applications. Next slide. So I just want to name two other resources for you before we get to questions with Paul and I. But the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has done phenomenal work here. I'm so grateful for their leadership in this work. They have a free tool that I would just get it out as wide as you can. It's really about how to stop the online spread of minor intimate images. In this Take It Down toolkit, there are resources for victims, there are resources for agencies and for schools, there are resources for parents. And so please be using the NCMEC tools. If you and integrate them into your incident response plan. These are relatively new tools developed in the last year. And I would also just name that they are great about continually updating these tools, and they are working really hard to think about the sort of institutional vectors of spread and how to equip folks to really handle this growing social crisis. And then please stay in touch with EdSafe on this work. We, as you all know, believe that safety, accountability, fairness, and efficacy are important guardrails around AI and education. Safety is table stakes. And so our AIPolicyLab.org website has model policies and model incidents response plans, not just from Linwood, but also around AI companions. It has model policies around stakeholder engagement, parent outreach. And so we hope it can be a treasure trove for the field around addressing a whole host of issues here. With that, Paul, will you join me?
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me to this important and ever-evolving conversation.
Ever evolving is a great way to describe it. So, Paul, one of the things that we talk about in this presentation is the role of content filtering. And we know that if you get E-rate funds, for example, you're obliged to have SIPA filtering. So, content filtering is something our schools and districts are already doing. Can you talk a little bit about how you see the intersection of content filtering and NCII and DFII, and particularly what Securely's doing in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are several layers to this. With the advancement of AI tools, it's becoming easier for even someone without coding experience to
Mm,
create an app like this and publish it. So our filter, most filters at this point, are constantly scanning. Anytime we see a student go to a site we've never seen before, we have our own AI that will crawl that site to try to figure out what it does. And it's very sensitive to these sorts of applications. It knows how to identify them and will instantly block those under a pornography category. So that's one way to prevent access
mhm.
from those apps. It's not perfect.
Right.
There are
And
definitely
no,
ways to
technology
hide these.
evolves. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And the creators of these apps know that we're looking for them, so they try to camouflage their intent. But the AI is improving for both of us, right? So we're
Hmm.
also getting better at detecting those.
Hmm.
So blocking the creation apps, blocking the distribution pages, those are important, and that's sort of the easy part of this.
Mm. Hmm.
The other side of this is, these can be created offline. You can run these sort of apps locally. You can run them on unmonitored devices. And then it's the distribution side, especially in a school network, right? If a student shares a selfie or one of these generated images uh, through their school email, you want to be able to detect that. And what our app does is we allow that to be quarantined. So as
Hmm.
soon as our engine detects that, which again, the AI is improving for them, it's improving for us. We're much better at detecting these now. Once we know that this is a nude image, regardless of the rest of the context of that image, we'll put that into a quarantined designated email inbox. So the school creates a quarantine at school.edu, and our engine will grab the image out of the student email as soon as it's detected before it can be shared, and put it into this quarantine space to try to keep the toothpaste in the tube, so to speak.
Hmm.
Um, and then that is, we'll then notify the appropriate personnel. You can designate who that notification staff member is. Some schools want that to be the principal at the school. Some schools have even decided, I want this to be notified to someone outside of the school. Because if this is a
Hmm.
student at my school, say I'm the principal, that can create an awkward situation now where I'm responsible for this image. And so we've created a platform where you can designate who that is. And we also have an image to text engine. So what we do is we blur these images. We don't host them on our own servers. We keep them
Hmm.
on the school server, which is very important, as you had mentioned in the slideshow. And we blur that image, and then we have a text description that kind of explains what that image is. Because many of our customers have very specific protocols around how they handle these. So they'll often have more than one person in the room when they unblur the image. All of this is documented. And then once it's unblurred, then you can start the process of, okay, how are we going to handle this?
Hmm. Hmm. I really appreciate, I want to hone in on 2 points. One, sometimes I hear from folks, I just can't keep up with this technology. And so can we talk a little bit about how fast this technology is evolving, the online versus offline? What advice would you give for state leaders, school district leaders around this idea of like the pace is going fast. I don't know how to keep up. Sometimes this is even being hosted on a social media engine. I mentioned the Grok work. Um, Tell me, like, what advice would you give?
Yeah, so I tend to think in analogies, right? And so much like maybe pest control, you want to have many layers to this, right?
Hmm.
So keeping your yard clean is a start, right? And then maybe having plugging all the holes in your house to make sure nothing's getting in, and then maybe treating with pesticide on the outside, but you're still going to want to have a fly swatter. So having a filter in place, having programs that educate your students on the risks and dangers of these. Some of these solutions are not technological, they're social in nature.
Hmm.
So making sure that students understand the risks and the downstream effects of this sort of behavior is very important. Then having a powerful detection engine in place, and then having a protocol when something is detected,
Mhm.
so that you can respond without having to improvise along the way. So everyone that's involved knows exactly how to handle this when you do find it. But there are multiple layers to it, and I think that that's the right approach, is to not try to find one tool that's going to fix this for you. But it's a process, and it requires everyone to be involved: parents, community, students, staff, teachers. They should all understand that this is real. It's
Yeah.
happening daily. Even if you don't see it, it is occurring. And so improving your ability to detect and knowing how to respond when you do.
I think that multi-layer offense, multi-layer defense is so, so important. As you think about the work of sort of CIOs and CTOs, when you think about the content work, when you think about the protocol work, when you talk about the incident response work, are there places where you feel like smaller districts could go for resources? How are you thinking about sort of differentiated resources for different sized districts and teams?
Yeah, it's a great point. So you had mentioned NCMIC, the National Center for Exploited Children, and we partner with them in a couple of ways, and they're a great resource for districts of any size.
Yeah,
So
we agree.
yeah. And one of the great things about the way they handle this is they share with tools like us what they call a hash table. So a hash is sort of an image fingerprint without actually sharing the image. And that allows us, because they share that with us daily, anything that they've registered in their database, we
Yeah.
can instantly flag and quarantine that image. And we partner with our schools, small and medium districts in particular, to help them through the process of reporting those images and sharing those hash tables out, because that benefits everyone, right? So that's one way to do it. If you Small and medium districts tend to not have very large IT teams.
Mhm.
Oftentimes, it's the science teacher who's the best at computers that ends up being in charge of IT. So finding Partnering with the solutions experts with whichever filter you're using,
Mhm.
they often have great advice on how to configure your various permissions in, say, Google Workspace or inside your Microsoft environment to make sure that it's configured properly so that you can minimize the chances of these sorts of events happening. And then also just partnering with your filtering solution to make sure that those configurations are optimized to limit the exposure and the opportunity for students to use these sorts of apps and tools.
Paul, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate the work that you all are doing, particularly in the AI space, to help lead the conversation, not just on this front, but also on the AI companions work as well that Securely has led. It's been an incredible pleasure to partner with you. I will say that there's a number of filtering solutions out there, not just Securely. And so thinking about who's the right partner for you and what does that look like, having that conversation with your filtering partner as a partnership, not just as sort of a vendor relationship, can be very helpful in working through these resources. I think for small and medium sized districts. And again, I just want to say it loud and clear, y'all. You cannot have a defense that we just simply didn't see it because we're not, it's not in our filters. That is actually not a defense. That might open you up to more liability. And so the ostrich effect, if you will, does not work here. There is foreseeable documented harm. There's guidance out now from the Department of Justice regarding take it down, non-consensual intimate images, public institutions, so on and so forth. And so we're at a place now where you cannot ignore this. You must take action and you must set up protocols, incident response plans, professional development, and content filtering that really shows that you're taking action to prevent this foreseeable harm. So I just want to double and triple click here that ignorance is not a strategy in this work. And none of you are pursuing that strategy because you're here in this webinar today. So spread the word. Okay, we are at the place where we are happy to take questions from the audience, either in the Q&A or in the chat directly. We have one coming in. So Alexandra, thanks for your question. At the elementary school level, most social media incidents are done with children who use the platforms illegally, as they're not old enough to even use the platform in the first place. And Alexander, I think you're talking about COPPA rules and the 13 sort of prohibitions on many of these platforms. When these incidents are initiated by minors against adults in the building, there are very limited protections or actions that can be pursued without filing a police report. What exemplar models have you seen for protecting adults from ill-informed student use while literacy catches up? Paul, anything you want to share here? I'm happy to share some of the things that we're seeing in this space.
Yeah, I mean, from the technology side, right, the inside the filtering on the school devices, you can be pretty strict at preventing that. But if the students have their own personal devices and they're outside of the purview of the school district, you're pretty limited on what can be done as far as the creation and distribution of that. So it comes back to having those protocols in place and making sure that the yeah, your team is ready to respond and involve local law enforcement and having that relationship established ahead of time, so it's not being created after the fact.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great point. And I also think one of the things that we are seeing a lot of schools work on is, um, you know, conversations with parents about this topic, informing, doing proactive education at technology literacy nights, AI literacy nights, having not being afraid to alert parents that this is happening, to build trust with parents that this is happening. And the other thing that we will say is depending on where you are, I know we have lots of different countries in the chat. There are different laws that govern the creation here. And thank you so much, Vanessa, for sharing Common Sense's articles with parents about topics like this. These are hard topics. These are challenging topics. No parent wants to imagine their child doing this or this happening to their child. No adult, frankly, wants this to imagine this happening to them. So these are hard topics and hard conversations. But the reality is that so much of the work that we have to be doing here is both about bystander education and that includes parents. And peer-to-peer education. And so making sure as well that adults are aware of if there's a tip line to report this. One of the things that we're seeing that's awesome. Thank you so much, Danielle, for sharing that tool in the chat. Such great sharing. Keep doing it. We'll send out all those resources with this webinar recording. How you have these conversations with your whole community, how you make adults aware of how they could report this to create a culture of safety with adults can be part of that professional development, can even be part of that code of conduct and training that you're doing as adults are coming back to school in professional development. So thank you for bringing up that point around the student to adult situation that we've seen emerge. And again, education here, bystander education, literacy education is one part of what needs to be a multifaceted strategy. Other questions? I taught middle school science, so I have really good hold time. Well, I also, because I taught middle school science, know the best thing you can do is let people out to recess early or dismiss them 1 to 2 minutes before the final bell. I was the bane of my school administrators. Oh, we have one more from Danielle. Danielle, we'll wait for you. Great. Couple smaller school districts with very limited budgets. These filters are extremely expensive. Any resources to help with these costs? So just a reminder that this isn't so I'll just say one thing and then and Paul invite you to come in here. A reminder that filtering is if you get federal E-rate dollars, filtering is an allowable expense under your E-rate budgets. And so that is something that is a reimbursable cost under E-rate. And actually, there's some E-rate action happening right now at the FCC, a new comment period. You'll get some notes from Innovate EDU on this opening next week on June 25th about E-rate and whether it should exist or it shouldn't exist, what filtering needs to be updated, so on and so forth. So pay attention for that, y'all. But just a reminder, you can use federal E-rate dollars to cover these costs for content filtering, particularly in response to SIPA. Paul?
Yeah, there are federal funds. Many states have state funding available. A lot of states now are partnering with filters to where the state will actually purchase the filter. And so you may want to check to see if there is a solution that's already been purchased in your state. And with, like most things, you will get what you pay for. And it's important to weigh not only the cost of the filter, but the cost of the inaction and what happens after the fact. And so it's like insurance, right? Nobody likes to pay for insurance until you need it. And so but yeah, the federal funding, there were a lot of good state funding available. So often, if you're talking to a vendor, they'll have a lot of knowledge and resources about the dollars that are available for you. So have that conversation with the sales rep.
It's great, great call. Um, so Danielle is asking about the home to school, out of school time sort of transom that happens with this, and frankly, like that's a very common thing that we've seen in cyberbullying and social media. That incidents are happening outside of school, and then they're not happening on school devices. They're not happening on school time, and then they come into the school, and police and law enforcement could be involved. How can schools respond, and how should we? So this is a place where I would just really encourage you to look at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children resources. They take a very victim trauma informed approach to this work, and that would be my sort of best piece of advice to you, Danielle, is to think about the existing resources that are out there in terms of restorative justice models, to think through and think about a victim first mentality. And again, if you know that this has happened to a student outside of school, those psychological harms and trauma that we described are likely to still happen. We're just getting emerging research around this area. And so, but there are some trends here around academic outcomes, absenteeism, and sort of long-term mental health impacts. So even if this happened outside of school, what are the counseling and social support resources you can provide? What about that long-term academic plan to keep that young person engaged? And if you know that perpetrator and that victim are in the same class, are in the same social circles, how can you take proactive responses to separate them? And even while they're going through a law enforcement process. And so again, that victim trauma informed approach and remembering that support needs to exist both for victims and for perpetrators, particularly when they're minors, is incredibly important. And we would just point you to a number of restorative justice approaches in this work. Paul, anything you would share there?
Yeah, I think there is a sort of a counterintuitive approach here of allowing access to certain social media within the school if you have a tool that can monitor it. So if you completely lock those sharing capabilities down, then students will go to their personal devices and do it there. But if they have the ability to share these things through their school devices, then that gives you the ability to watch and see and be informed of what's happening there. And then the other thing, our solution is a bit unique here, but having a BYOD network available, a Wi-Fi network that is in your building where
Mm-hmm.
students can connect their personal devices to that network versus using their data plan will often mean that that traffic is now something that you can see and observe as well. So even though it's happening on their personal devices, our smart DNS is able to decrypt and recognize who's sharing that information on those personal devices if it's traveling through that BYOD network.
Yeah, thank you. Great response. So Alexandra has another question for us around social media platforms and their self-reporting process, which I will name they are federally mandated to have. So first of all, it's the law that they have those direct links and direct contact with law enforcement. So I want to make sure we have a good understanding of that and that they have to have a reporting function. Um, so a principal who doesn't have Snapchat can't report that image as they might not have the app. Platforms have separate venues. We've just described some of those to work with law enforcement, but not with schools. How can we advocate for platform changes or work with these companies more efficiently so we don't need to use law enforcement? So I'm going to just say one thing. We're not going to, they're going to need to interact with law enforcement because it's the federal law. And so, and oftentimes there's state laws as well. And so one of the things to be doing is many schools do this. I used to lead a school in Brooklyn, and we had the best relationship with our Brooklyn Police Department, NYPD. Shout out to the precinct there. They were wonderful. But developing those relationships with law enforcement is really important. But I just want to challenge the premise of this question, which is that these platforms are going to be mandatorily obligated to intersect with law enforcement. Paul, would you share anything here?
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. I think that the teams that work at the companies are pretty passionate about this and they want to do right by the consumers. That same notion may not be shared by the stakeholder, the shareholders, and the CEOs of the companies. I think they had to be forced, their hands had to be pushed in this direction. But the resources that they do have available, the people that work at those teams, we've interfaced with them before, and they really do care and they want to do right by the users and the consumers. So
Yeah, and again, I think one of the proactive strategies here is to build those relationships with local law enforcement, and and for them to have an understanding of what your disciplinary process is for the perpetrator, but also what your support process is for the victim. That can help mitigate some of the challenges that I know many of us have when we have a student who might not understand the consequences of what seems like a fun game or a fun app. And they don't understand um, potentially how they have victimized someone or that they've committed a crime. With that, Paul, I am so grateful for you joining us today. Thank you so much. I'm grateful for Securely and Tammy's leadership here. I'm grateful for your partnership with EdSafe AI and really thankful for the conversation today. As I shared all of these resources, including the ones some of you shared in the chat, we're going to be sharing with those of you who registered for this webinar. This will be on the AIPolicyLab.org website. And everybody who registered will get the recording. And so if you're watching this from the comfort of your home much later in the day today or this weekend, thank you for helping us spread the word both about this challenge and how as schools, districts, communities, we really need to respond. Have a great day. Thanks so much.